We'd like to welcome everyone to a new study on Tuesday nights in the fourth quarter of this year on the subject of church history. For the last quarter, there have been classes on Tuesday night, or a class on Tuesday night, on the subject of crucifixion of Christ. And I might say that was a very scholarly study. This study won't be so scholarly. I will not be having any works of art to show on the screen. As far as that goes, I will have nothing to show on the screen. But to offset that lack of scholarly class, it'll be shorter. And so that'll be an offset. Of course, this will be a lecture. I prefer to teach, and most people do, with a class of folks where there can be participation. But, of course, this is not possible with this kind of presentation. The material that I've chosen does lend itself more to lecture than it would be a class type of arrangement. So the subject, as I said, is church history. Of course, church history is a very large subject. It would be impossible to get anywhere close to doing justice to a study of all of church history in 13 weeks. So we will focus the study on just one period of time, and that is the 19th century. From 1800 to 1906 will be the time frame that we will cover in this study. I actually taught this material 2.5 years ago here in a class, about 30 students in there. So it's going to be the same material as I covered then. So those of you who were in that class, you may find it convenient to do something else. You know, people watch the movie It's a Wonderful Life over and over again. I'm not sure this material is as exciting as that would be. However, we do study books of the Bible over and over and get something out of the studies every time, something new that we learn. So anyway, whether you've had it before or not, welcome to this study. As we look at the New Testament, we find that the church is described. Jesus promised to build his church in Matthew 16:18. And as you look at the book of Acts and the following epistles, you see the church being formed and started in various locations. You see the work of the church. You learn the worship of the church. And so the New Testament completely provides all the information we need regarding the church that Jesus built. But what happened was, after a period of time, there began to be departures from what the New Testament taught. The first departure actually started in the 2nd century and involved the organization of the church. The New Testament church government, as is described in the New Testament, has elders as overseers, shepherds or bishops, or the different titles that are used for those who were to oversee the work of the church. There were deacons that served the church, of course, evangelists, teachers, but the elders were to oversee the work. And the elders back then had meetings, and those meetings were generally, there was one man, one elder who would preside over the meetings. Same thing, we do the same thing today. The church here has elders, and we meet, the elders meet every second and fourth Sunday of the month, and at each meeting there's an elder who presides over the meeting. That takes the minutes, types the minutes, and presides over each meeting. Now, we do that, though, alphabetically. Each elder takes a turn. We move through the alphabet, and then we start over again. Well, what happened in the New Testament, or in the second century, rather, one of the elders, after a while, one elder started doing all the presiding over the meetings, and so they came up with a title for that elder, and the presiding elder then was called a bishop. Then each bishop, after a period of time, was assigned a certain territory, which was called a diocese. Then came city bishops and country bishops. City bishops, of course, would be over a number of churches in a city. Country bishops over several churches in the country. And then there were conventions and councils and synods. And after a few centuries, by the 4th and 5th century, we had the formation of the Catholic Church. It was fully formed, Roman Catholic Church, by that time. And then for about the next 10 centuries, you had the Catholic Church being the dominant church. There may have been small groups here or there, and there were, but as far as history goes, it focuses almost entirely on the Roman Catholic Church. Then along about the 15th century, there was a movement called the Reformation, and the goal was, or the effort was, to reform the Catholic Church, which some felt had drifted from its original principles. And one of the greatest reformers, or the greatest reformer, in my opinion, was a man by the name of Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born in 1483 and lived to 1546. He was a German, and his primary goal was not to start another church. I know there's a church today that has Luther's name, but his goal at that time was to reform the Catholic Church. And then that began a movement called the Reformation. There have been a lot, of course, many books written on the church history. One of the best works was written by a man by the name of Philip Schaff. He lived from 1819 to 1893. He was from Switzerland, and he wrote the history of the Christian church, and it consisted of 8 volumes. It's the most comprehensive history available. And he interpreted the Reformation as a religious movement that sought to recover the purity of the primitive Christianity that is depicted in the New Testament. And then, of course, after Luther, there were many others, noted preachers and reformers that then began to work in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And then we get to the time period that this class is going to cover, and that's the 19th century. And we, that is members of Churches of Christ and Christian churches, refer to this as the Restoration Movement. If you look at general church history books, they continue to call that time frame the Reformation movement. But we refer to it the Restoration Movement, and we'll understand that as we further go through this class. The best work most comprehensive work that I have found on this time frame was written by a man by the name of Earl West. Earl was born in 1920 and lived to 2011. And he wrote 4 volumes on the church, this time frame, which was called the name of the study was Search for the Ancient Order. And he actually wrote 4 volumes, but 2 volumes covered the time frame of this class, 1800 to 1906. And then he wrote 2 more volumes covering the time frame from 1906 to 1950. And the reason 1906 is used is because that was the time of the census. And at that particular census in 1906, there was a division a recorded division of Churches of Christ and Christian churches that occurred at that time. The census was separated. There have been other books that have been written, one of which is called Reviving the Ancient Faith. It was written by Richard Hughes. He spent 14 years writing the book. It covers Churches of Christ in America during this time frame. Herald wrote a book, Churches of Christ in the 20th Century, both good studies. So then we will follow primarily, though, in this study, the work of Earl West. Earl West became an author as a young man. He wrote the first volume when he was 29 years old. As I said, he was born in 1920, and he was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. After finishing his high school, he went to college at Freed-Hardeman College in Henderson, Tennessee. He graduated there from that school, at that time a two-year institution, and moved to Abilene Christian College in Abilene, Texas. And there he received his BA degree, and then he did some studies at George Pepperdine College in California, now Pepperdine University. And then he did graduate work in the School of Religion at Butler University, where he received his MA and BD degrees, and then got his PhD at Indiana University. So he's well qualified to write this history. As we look at this time frame, we see that it was a period, the 1800s, and then prior to that, a couple centuries or three before that, there was a lot of religious fervor. And it was a time when people focused more on religion than today. Today, religion is on the decline. And the U.S. and other countries. I read not long ago that in England, 6% of the population attend church on a regular basis. Now, the U.S. is higher than that, but the numbers in the U.S. have been declining for several years. The surveys and census taken show that interest in religion, that is church attendance, church membership, is on decline, and that's for all churches, all mainline denominational churches. Churches of Christ have lost membership. The only area that, or one of the only area that I know of that's growing, some of the evangelical churches have grown, but overall, Christianity has suffered losses. So this time frame that we will be talking about, though, there was a lot of religious fervor in the 1800s, and a time where people had more time to spend in religion. There was no television, of course, and no social media, no computers, and so people had more time to focus on religious matters. So although the political implications far overshadowed the religious, yet the revolt of the American colonies against the tyranny of King George III was really as much for religious freedom as it was for political. Consequently then, in the pre-Revolutionary War days, the most popular and well-known church was the established church, and the established church was the Church of England. The clergy of the established church ruled affairs in the colonies with an iron hand. An assembly held in March 1624 in Virginia provided that all must attend divine services on Sunday. That was, everyone was to attend services. Whoever missed once without an allowable excuse was fined 1 pound of coffee. A month missing in a row caused a fine of 50 pounds of coffee. That sounds like a pretty good idea in some ways. We have sometimes problems with church attendance, and it would make it a lot easier if you could find people. But of course, we don't do that. In fact, they ruled with such an iron hand that no man was allowed to sell his tobacco until the preacher gave his permission. By 8 years later, by 1632, the laws were revised some. Non-attendance at services cost the guilty party 1 shilling instead of a pound of coffee. And then by 1642, things changed. So we see that the church was very rigorous up to that time, and the church did rule with, as I said already, with an iron hand for a period of time. In fact, captains of ships were fined 100 pounds of sterling for bringing Quakers into the state of Virginia. There was religious persecution that occurred then. All Quakers were imprisoned without bail. Persecution also raised against the Baptists. The first Baptists came to Virginia in 1714. So there was a lot of persecution. The Church of England was the dominant church. It ruled, and it made most of the laws for the people. There was a bill for religious freedom that the General Assembly tried to pass in 1779, but it failed. But it was 7 years before Thomas Jefferson's Bill of Righteous Freedom passed, but it was 1801 before the final vestige of church and state union were abolished. So early on, there was religion and the state were together, but that was abolished in 1801. Meanwhile, leaven was at work among the colonial churches of the established order. As early as 1729, this leaven had begun working in England when John Wesley, noting the formality and tyranny of the church, proposed forming societies within the church dedicated to purifying the corrupt elements. Wesleyan preachers were still Anglicans at that time. Wesley himself lived and died a member of the Anglican Church and was buried in his Anglican robes. Westland Societies came to be established by persons demanding a holier life on the part of members of the church. The first, and of course, as we know, John Wesley, or those who know church history, John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church, even though he was an Anglican, because of the things he did. And the first Methodist Church was established in this country, in the U.S., in 1784. But there was disagreement over the government of the church. Francis Asbury, who wanted to place himself at the top position as the head of the new church. He was the superintendent of the Methodist Church and took that top position. He was opposed mainly by a man by the name of James O'Kelly. O'Kelly was born sometime in the mid-1700s, and he listened early on to the preachers and read the sermons they brought to this country, which had been delivered by John Wesley. O'Kelly was struck by the fact that Wesley and those like him, gave all sufficiency to the Bible. Wesley said, we will be downright Christians. And this pleased O'Kelly. He liked that approach. At a conference in Virginia in in 1779, the question of sprinkling or immersion for baptism came up. O'Kelly dogmatically maintained that sprinkling was baptism and remained with this belief until his death. Moreover, a measure was passed through the conference which said all preachers were to make it a matter of conscience to rise at 4 or 5 in the morning, and it was declared a shame for a preacher to be in bed at 6 o'clock. Preachers, being what they are, have never liked this, and it brought O'Kelly a measure of disrepute. According to the Methodist government at this time, the power of appointing preachers rested in the hands of the superintendent, and in this case was Francis Asbury, as we mentioned. The preacher took the circuit appointed to him, and there was little he could do about it. Another general conference was held in 1792, and O'Kelly and 3 other cohorts introduced the motion that a preacher be given the right of appeal to the conference if it didn't like his appointment. O'Kelly and his cohorts lost. They continued with the government the way they had it. But there was one of those men who stood with O'Kelly. His name was Rice Haggard. And the two of them set about reforming the Methodist Church, or actually starting another church. Another conference was held by that group in Virginia, December 25th, 1793, and the group decided to officially sever all relations with the Methodist Episcopal Church. They took the name Republican Methodists. Theirs was a Republican, no slavery, glorious, free from all evils of misgovernment. At the next general meeting in August 1794, they devised a plan for church government. They decided to lay aside every manuscript and go by the Bible alone. Rice Haggard stood up and said, "Brethren, this is a sufficient rule of faith and practice. By it we are told that the disciples were called Christians, and I move that henceforth and forever the followers of Christ be known as Christians simply." There was another brother there who made the statement that they should take the Bible itself as their only creed. And they came up with what they call the 5 cardinal principles of the Christian church. Haggard had said, "Brethren, this is a sufficient rule," following the Bible, first of all, and practice. By it, we are told that disciples were called Christians, and I move henceforth that follows Christ be called Christians simply. But the 5 cardinal principles: the Lord Jesus Christ, number 1, as the only head of the church. Number 2, the name Christian to the exclusion of party and sectarian names. Number 3, the Holy Bible, or the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, our only creed, and a sufficient rule of faith and practice. Number 4, Christian character, the only test of church fellowship and membership. And number 5, the right of private judgment and the liberty of conscience, the privilege and duty of all. And in 1801, the Republican Methodists changed their name to the Christian Church. So theirs was a movement to overthrow human elements in religion and to go only by the Scriptures. That weaknesses appear in their 5 cardinal principles is evident, but they were on the high road back to the ancient order. But that they were on the high road back to the ancient order is equally evident. You see the efforts they were making, the movement, the direction which they were headed. They were trying to get away from the established church, established churches, and trying to get back just to what the New Testament taught. So while the leaven of restoration was working among the Methodists in Virginia and North Carolina, O'Kelly and the people who worked with him worked in North Carolina and Virginia mostly. It was also working among the Baptists in Vermont and New Hampshire. Here the movement was led by a man by the name of Elias Smith and another man by the name of Abner Jones. Elias Smith was born in 1769 in Connecticut. His mother was a New Light Congregationalist who believed in sprinkling. She had her 3 children sprinkled, and Elias shared this fate, although he rebelled against it. In May 1979, when Smith was only 10 years old, he was living in Connecticut, and he gave considerable study upon the subject of baptism and finally convinced himself that believers were the only people to be baptized and that immersion was the proper method, and so therefore he was immersed. Then in the summer of 1789, when Smith was then 20 years old, he began thinking of becoming a preacher. And he found himself gradually working his way into becoming a preacher in the Baptist church, not the church that his mother was a member of. In the early fall of 1801, Smith moved to Salisbury, New Hampshire. And by now he had begun to have some misgivings about certain doctrines in the Baptist church, particularly that of Calvinism. He said a man can not study the Bible long, intelligently, and independently without coming to some definite convictions about the truth. And so he writes the following: when in my 24th year, I believed there would be a people bearing a name different from all the denominations then in this country. But what would they be called? I then could not tell. In the spring of 1802, having rejected the doctrine of Calvin and Universalism, to search the Scriptures to find the truth, I found the name which the followers of Christ ought to wear, which was Christians. Acts 11:26. At Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in October 1802, the friends of Elias Smith rented a hall called Jefferson Hall over the market and began holding regular meetings here every Sunday morning. Arrangements were made for Smith and his family to move there, which they did early the following December. Unfortunately, the hall burned down on December the 26th, and few people were left without a meeting house. There were only 5 members of the church, but they began to discuss ways and means of organizing themselves into a church. These meetings were held in a schoolhouse. Smith writes again in March 1803, when our number was some short of 20, we agreed to consider ourselves a Church of Christ. Now, that's not a Church of Christ, official name Church of Christ. That's a little c church. That is a church that belongs to Christ. Owing to him, that he said, as our only master, Lord, and lawgiver. And we agreed to consider ourselves Christians. 1 year later, there were 150 members. By this time, the church purchased a lot with a small building on it, and they continued to meet. In June 1803, about the time of this difficulty, Elder Abner Jones, that I mentioned already, from Vermont, came to visit me, Smith says, and was the first free man I have ever seen. In some ways, Smith admitted Jones had gone beyond him in his thinking about this restoration idea. The brethren had been meeting to draw up church articles, and they referred in this meeting they referred to as a Christian conference. But in 1805, when this conference met, it was agreed that the articles were useless, and they abandoned them, taking the New Testament as the only and all-sufficient rule for Christians. On September 1, 1808, Elias Smith issued from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the first issue of the Herald of Gospel Liberty, a religious paper. He had only 274 subscribers. This was the first religious paper, according to Smith, anyway, ever to be published in the world. I'm not sure he knew for sure, but that was his claim, the very first paper to ever be published. But what were the convictions that the Herald professed? On the whole, they were about the same as those espoused by James O'Kelly that we talked about earlier. On December 18th, 1808, a William Gurry of Virginia wrote in the paper, "After we became a separate people, 3 points were determined on. First, no head over the church but Christ. Second, no confession of faith, articles of religion, canons, creeds, etc., but the New Testament. Third, no religious name but Christians." So, of hardly less significance than Elias Smith was Abner Jones, as we mentioned. Jones was born in Massachusetts in 1772, 3 years younger than Smith. When he was 8 years old, his parents moved to Bridgewater, Vermont. Until he was 20 years old, he lived an irreligious and reckless life. For a time, he taught school in New York, and in the spring of 1793 was converted and baptized into the Baptist Church. Shortly afterwards, Jones began to study and preach some. He became very much concerned with what to preach, and he determined to study the Scriptures to find out. He was soon led to dissent from Calvinism, and the result was the Baptist Church gave him the cold shoulder. He became more determined than ever to study the Bible and to preach just what he taught. It was in the fall of 1801 that he organized this free church in Linden, which rejected human names, members insisting solely upon the name Christian. In 1802, he organized churches at Hanover and Piermont, New Hampshire. From here on, his life is connected with that of Elias Smith in establishing these free churches in New England. This New England movement, as we have said, owes its primary significance to the fact that men and women were looking in the direction of the New Testament order of things and away from sectarianism. So here we see examples of a couple of individuals in each place in the South, Virginia, North Carolina, and in the North, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, where people were moving away from the established churches and trying to get back to only the New Testament teaching. The next two people we will look at, not tonight, but our next meeting. Of course, next week will be our Bible study series, so we will not be meeting next week. We won't meet again for this class until 2 weeks from tonight, which will be October the 20th, I believe. And we will talk about Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell, who were the two most dominant men of this restoration movement. And we'll talk about those at that time. But tonight, we will, we wouldn't have time to get into either one of those because they're more lengthy in the work they did. And so we will talk about those next week. So tonight, we will end there, and we will let us have a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful unto you for all that you do for us, all the blessings you bestow upon us. We're thankful that we can look back in church history and we can learn from these men who were determined to serve you, were determined to do things that you had instructed in your word, and they were willing to be persecuted and to work hard to follow only your word. Help us to learn from them. Help us to have the determination ourselves to do those things which are in accordance with your will and to always serve you faithfully. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you.